If you walk through the hallowed grounds of the Gettysburg National Military Park today, or browse through the dusty archives of the American Civil War, you are presented with a version of history that feels carved from marble. We are taught to see this era as a time of supreme seriousness, a tragedy performed by stoic men with magnificent beards who spoke in biblical cadences and made noble sacrifices for high ideals. We picture Abraham Lincoln carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, Robert E. Lee grappling with his loyalty to his state, and Ulysses S. Grant staring grimly into the future. It is a history painted in shades of gray and sepia, dignified and solemn. But history, when you peel back the layers of myth and statue polish, is rarely just about noble men doing noble things. History is often shaped by the chaotic, the narcissistic, and the absolute lunatics who somehow stumble into positions of power. And there is perhaps no figure in American history who embodies this chaos more perfectly than Major General Daniel Edgar Sickles. To call Dan Sickles a character is a massive understatement. If you were to write a novel about a man who was a corrupt politician, a cold-blooded murderer, the inventor of the temporary insanity defense, a general who nearly lost the war because of his own ego, a diplomat who slept with a deposed queen, and a one-legged man who visited his own severed limb in a museum for 50 years, publishers would reject it for being too unrealistic. Yet Dan Sickles was very real, and his life was a tornado that tore through the 19th century. To understand the disaster that was General Sickles, one must first understand the scoundrel that was Dan the politician. Born in New York City in 1819, Sickles was a creature of Manhattan. He was handsome, charismatic, wealthy, and possessed a moral compass that pointed exclusively toward whatever benefited Dan Sickles. He rose through the ranks of Tammany Hall, the infamous political machine that ran New York City through a potent mix of bribery, violence, and Irish whiskey. Sickles fit right in. He was a man of voracious appetites, loving expensive wine, fine clothes, and women, lots of women. He delighted in shocking the uptight Victorian society of the time. He was known to take a notorious prostitute named Fanny White to formal government dinners, parading her in front of the horrified elite just to watch them squirm. On one occasion, he even brought her onto the floor of the New York State Assembly, introducing her to legislators, an act for which he was formally censured, but for which he felt absolutely no shame. Despite his reputation as a libertine, he managed to woo and marry the teenage daughter of his music teacher, a girl named Teresa Baggioli. She was young, naive, and stunningly beautiful, and Sickles treated her like a trophy to be displayed when convenient and ignored when he wanted to pursue his own hedonistic interests. By the late 1850s, Sickles had climbed the political ladder to become a U.S. congressman, moving his young family to Washington, D.C. At that time, Washington was not the sprawling metropolis of today. It was a swampy, gossip-fueled small town where everyone knew everyone's business, and the Sickles household, located on Lafayette Square directly across from the White House, became the center of the social scene. But while Dan was busy climbing the political ladder and chasing other women, Teresa was left lonely and neglected. And in a town full of dashing diplomats and politicians, a lonely, beautiful woman does not stay lonely for long. Enter Philip Barton Key. The name might sound familiar because Philip was the son of Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote The Star-Spangled Banner. Philip was the district attorney for the District of Columbia, a handsome widower and the most eligible bachelor in the city. He saw the neglected Teresa, and a passionate affair began. They were not exactly subtle about it. "It's up, 10. Key rented a shabby house in a poor African-American neighborhood exclusively for their rendezvous, but he would also brazenly ride his horse past the Sickles mansion, signaling to Teresa by waving a white handkerchief. If she waved back from the window, the coast was clear. The interesting. It was a romance played out in the open, and soon all of Washington was whispering about it. Eventually, the rumors reached Dan Sickles in the form of an anonymous letter, likely written by a jealous suitor or a political rival. The letter was brutal in its detail, describing exactly where the lovers met and how often. For a narcissist like Sickles, this was not just heartbreak, it was a catastrophic injury to his massive ego. He confronted Teresa, forcing her to write out a detailed confession of her sins, a cruel act of psychological torture. But a confession was not enough to cleanse his stained honor. On a Sunday morning in February 1859, Sickles looked out of his window and saw Philip Barton Key standing in Lafayette Park, waving his handkerchief, utterly unaware that his life was about to end. Sickles snapped. He donned a heavy overcoat, stuffed 2 pistols into his pockets, and marched out of his front door. He walked across the street into the park where Key, seeing him approach, extended a hand for a friendly greeting. Sickles ignored the hand and shouted, "Key, you scoundrel! You have dishonored my home! You must die!" Dan pulled a pistol. He, realizing this was not a drill, reached into his coat, but he had no weapon, only a pair of opera glasses. Sickles fired. The first shot grazed Key, and the 2 men grappled in the mud for a moment before Sickles broke free. As Key stumbled back, pleading for his life and screaming, "Murder!" Sickles fired again, hitting him in the chest. Key fell to the ground. Sickles stood over the son of the national anthem's author and fired a final shot directly at his head. The gun jammed. Calmly, Sickles pulled out his second pistol, put it to the dying man's chest, and fired again. It was a cold-blooded execution committed in broad daylight, witnessed by a dozen people, practically on the president's front lawn. Sickles did not run. He walked to the home of the Attorney General, surrendered his weapon, and confessed. This should have been the end of Dan Sickles. It was clearly first-degree murder. UPSA to the Y. But Sickles was a showman, and his trial became the first trial of the century in American history. He hired a dream team of lawyers, including Edwin Stanton, who would later become Lincoln's fearsome Secretary of War. They knew they could not argue that he didn't do it. Too many people saw him. Instead, they invented a brand new legal strategy. They argued that Sickles, upon seeing the man who defiled the sanctity of his marriage, was overcome by a brainstorm, a sudden mental break that rendered him unable to distinguish right from wrong for those specific few minutes. They called it temporary insanity. It was the first time this defense was successfully used in the United States. The all-male jury, sympathetic to the wronged husband narrative, bought it completely. They acquitted Sickles. The courtroom erupted in cheers, and he was hailed as a hero who had defended the American home. However, Sickles soon made a mistake that society could not forgive. He publicly forgave Teresa. The public loved the murder because it was about honor, but they hated the reconciliation because it suggested he lacked principles. He was ostracized, shamed, and his political career was left in ruins. Then came 1861. The Civil War broke out. For most of the nation, it was a tragedy. For Dan Sickles, it was a career opportunity. He saw the war as his path to redemption. He went to President Lincoln and offered to raise troops from the Democratic strongholds of New York. Lincoln, who found Sickles entertaining and needed the soldiers, Agreed. Sickles used his charisma to recruit thousands of men, roughnecks, brawlers, and firemen into what he called the Excelsior Brigade. Because the military system of the time was chaotic, the man who raised the troops often got to command them. Thus, Daniel Sickles, a man with zero military experience, no tactical training, and whose only combat experience was shooting an unarmed man in a park, was made a brigadier general. Throughout the early years of the war, Sickles was surprisingly competent, mostly because his arrogance was mistaken for bravery. He fought in the Peninsula Campaign and at Chancellorsville, rising to the command of the I Tree Corps of the Army of the Potomac. By July 1863, he was one of the highest-ranking generals in the Union Army, marching toward a small town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. It was here that his ego would nearly destroy the United States. On the second day of the battle, July 2nd, the Union Commander General George Meade ordered Sickles to hold a specific position on the left flank of the Union line, running along Cemetery Ridge to a rocky hill called Little Round Top. It was a strong defensive position. But Sickles didn't like it. He looked forward and saw a patch of higher ground near a peach orchard and a wheat field about half a mile in front of the main line. To his untrained eye, that ground looked better. Without permission, and in direct defiance of his orders, Sickles ordered his entire corps of 10,000 men to march forward, disconnecting them from the rest of the Union Army. He moved his men into an exposed, indefensible position, creating a massive salient that could be attacked from three sides. He essentially served his 10,000 men up on a platter to the Confederate Army. General Meade was horrified when he arrived and saw what Sickles had done, but it was too late to pull back. The Confederates, led by General James Longstreet, launched a massive assault. The fighting that followed in the peach orchard and the wheat field was some of the bloodiest of the entire war. Sickles's corps was pulverized. The Union line was shattered, and only desperate fighting and sheer luck prevented a total Confederate victory that day. Amidst this chaos, Sickles was on horseback, trying to rally his crumbling troops, smoking a cigar and looking every bit the martial hero he pretended to be. Suddenly, a Confederate cannonball came screaming through the air. It slammed into Sickles' right leg, shattering the bones. As he was pulled from his horse, his leg hanging by shreds of flesh, Sickles didn't scream. He knew all eyes were on him. He reportedly removed the cigar from his mouth, calmly said, "General, I am hurt," and then, as he was being carried off the field on a stretcher, he puffed on his cigar and waved to his troops to keep their morale up. It was the performance of a lifetime. His leg was amputated that afternoon in a field hospital. In those days, amputated limbs were typically thrown into piles and buried in mass pits. But Dan Sickles was not about to let a part of himself be discarded so easily. When he ordered the doctors to save the leg, he had it preserved in a coffin-like box and sent to the newly formed Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C., accompanied by a card that read, "With the compliments of Major General D.E. Sickles survived the war, and his leg bone became a museum exhibit." But the story doesn't end there. After the war, Sickles launched a massive public relations campaign to rewrite history. He claimed that his disastrous move at Gettysburg was actually a stroke of genius that absorbed the Confederate shock and saved the Army. He attacked General Meade's reputation relentlessly, and because he lived for another 50 years, he eventually wore his critics down. He lived a life that would make a rock star blush. President Grant sent him to Spain as a diplomat, where he earned the nickname the Yankee King of Spain and reportedly had an affair with the deposed Queen Isabella Gio. He returned to Congress, blew through his fortune, faced embezzlement charges, and alienated his family. But he did one good thing. He played a crucial role in legislation to turn the Gettysburg battlefield into a national park, ensuring the preservation of the land where he had made his greatest mistake. For the rest of his life, Sickles remained a celebrity in New York. And every year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, he would travel to Washington, D.C. to visit the Army Medical Museum. He would hobble in on his crutches, often bringing friends or admirers, and lead them to the glass case containing his own shattered tibia and fibula. He would stand there, staring at his own bones, retelling the story of how he saved the Union. When monuments were being erected at Gettysburg for all the Corps commanders, there was a rule that no general could have a statue while they were still alive. Sickles lived so long, dying in 1914 at the age of 94, that he outlived almost everyone else. When asked why there was no monument to him at Gettysburg, he famously replied, "The entire battlefield is a monument to Dan Sickles. He died as he lived, in chaos, controversial to the end, but undeniably unforgettable." Today, you can still visit the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Maryland and see the bones of Dan Sickles, sitting in a glass case next to a cannonball, a silent testament to the wildest man in American history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this wild ride through history, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories. See you in the next video.